Good evening, everyone. We are now at the end of the book of Daniel, chapter 4. Now, Daniel, chapter 4, starting from verse 36, we need to remind ourselves that this is a letter that was actually sent by King Nebuchadnezzar to all the peoples, nations, and tongues or languages in his entire vast kingdom. It has already happened, and this letter is basically explaining the importance of the lesson that he had learned. And so he described how he had a dream and how he had Daniel to interpret or give understanding to the dream. And he then described exactly what happened. And he didn't think very much about it after a year when God gave him a year's time to repent of his arrogance and pride. He knew about Elah, the God Most High, who is up there. And in his mind, uh, that God is not going to care about his daily affairs. But he was wrong. And so in 12 months, everything in that dream happened. And that took place for 7 years. During that 7 years, he was behaving like an animal. He did not possess his human faculty, and that he was living in the fields with the animals of the fields. And during this time, it was believed that his son was actually running the show, so to speak, ruling Babylon during this 7 years of his absence. The end of this letter was explained to everyone how important Elah, or God Most High, is. Contrary to his understanding, this God is a God who is above all. Everything will happen according to what this God will do. It is actually a very important lesson to teach Nebuchadnezzar that it is the Most High, the Elah, who is over all kings and kingdoms, including his. And it is the dominion of the God Most High that is more important than Babylon. And now back into today's lesson, Daniel chapter 4 and verse 36 says this: At that time, and this word at that time literally means at the end of the 7 years. At the end of the 7 years. While he was there in the field like an animal, then it says here that my senses, my reason returned to me. This word, senses or reason, is actually senses. My senses return to me. Or you could say that this is his understanding, his knowledge. His knowledge as a human, his understanding as a human. All of these are good words to use, basically telling us that while he was behaving like an animal, he didn't have his senses, his reasoning. Now it came back to him so that he becomes a full human again in his senses. And my majesty and splendor, all of these, uh, was restored to me for the honor of my kingdom. Now, this is, I guess, a bit of problem in the translation. And it says here, and the glory of my kingdom. I think that would be important. and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the honor of my kingdom. What really did happen was that whatever is for his kingdom had the original, what would be the original might, the original majesty, and more. That is what he's trying to say. That it was restored to me, uh, and God blessed him with all these things. So the glory of my kingdom came back and my appearance. Now, this word splendor is an appearance, meaning whatever was transformed in that 7 years, and he was behaving like an animal with long fingernails like claws, then his original form and shape came back. So was the honor and majesty of his kingdom, and more. That is interesting. And then he said that his ministers, his sages, his nobles came to seek me out because they missed him for 7 years. So I was reestablished in my kingdom, in my sovereignty, and it surpassed the greatness that was added to me. These are important words. First, he got back his original majesty, and God gave him more. That means that he has learned his lesson well. How did he learn his lesson? In that 7 years, he may not be behaving like a human. He behaved more like an animal, ate like an animal, behaved and walked like an animal. And now he is back in his prime, like it was 7 years ago. And watch what he says in verse 37. He says, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar. Notice the word king is dropped. Now, what this means, or what this signifies, is that he is humbled. Even though now his glory is greater and it got added to it, he stopped calling himself King Nebuchadnezzar. He was calling himself King Nebuchadnezzar earlier, but now after everything was over, he just merely called himself simply Nebuchadnezzar. I think this is a very important identifier that symbolizes that Nebuchadnezzar now understands who is God and who is man. And he says this: praise, exalt, honor the King of heaven, or the King of the skies. The word heaven is used for God. And once you look up there, the Eastern people consider God to be the king up there. They don't look at God, in this case, Ila'a, or the God Most High, as the God on the land, on earth. But now Nebuchadnezzar has seen the God above, the King of heaven, is concerned with human endeavor, contrary to his belief, contrary to what he thought, that he was going to be the king on earth. But no, the king of Babylon, the vastness and greatness and majestic and splendor of King Nebuchadnezzar, he is still a subject of the King of heaven. So he says, praise, exalt, honor, or lift up. This word honor here literally means to glorify, to project the glory of God, for all his works are true. This word true literally means it is truth. It is truthful. It can be supported. Can be supported. He is not saying that it is true because he believes in his mind that it's true. He says that it is true because he has experienced it to be true. For 7 years, he was living in the judgment of God to bring down his arrogance to the level below the human dignity. And so he says, his ways are just. Now, the ways are just literally means that his judgment is fair. No, this is his judgment, his fairness in dealing with Nebuchadnezzar. He is literally saying that the punishment that God meted out for him is just. And what was the consequence? He says that he's able to humble those who walk in pride. The word pride here literally means arrogance. Arrogance. Who conduct himself in arrogance. What is he saying? He is basically saying that all of these words that he knows is true, that he knows God is just in his judgment, that he is able to humble those who conduct themselves in arrogance. And the word humble here literally means to bring low. This is the understanding in the Eastern sense. When you are lifted high, it is called pride. And if it is low, debased, it is humility. And so he is saying that God is able to bring someone from the high to the low. And this was what exactly happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He has experienced God's truth, God's justice, and God's humbling experience. And he gives God the praise, exalts him up, and glorifies him. And he calls himself simply Nebuchadnezzar. This tells us that in this letter, that he is willing to show the entire world that he has learned his lessons well. That this God, the King of heaven, is not to be trifled with. This God, who is the King of heaven, is a God of the highest. And in so doing, do not offend him. He is not a God who is obscure, that doesn't care about the way of life on earth. He is a God who pays attention to people who are arrogant, and he can bring the arrogant to be humble. And I, Nebuchadnezzar, have experienced it. This is the conclusion of chapter 4. We begin with Daniel chapter 5. Now, Daniel chapter 5 is what we would call the end game of the kingdom of Babylon. As you know, in the way that the Aramaic is being written, you don't find the and thens of the Hebrew style of writing. And so in chapter 5, verse 1, it just suddenly begins of somebody called Belshazzar. Belshazzar uh, was called the king And he held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. Herein, we would need to deal with a little bit of the history lesson. I think that would be important. The history lesson tells us this: Belshazzar, in according to the secular history, was not known as a king. And so let me just give you a background. In the history of this period of the kings of Babylon, we would need to understand that our interest is really in Nebuchadnezzar. And he was that king that God had revealed his message in the form of a dream. That would be Daniel chapter 2. That he had a dream of that metallic image, and he would be the head of gold. What happened is we would have the story of Nebuchadnezzar in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. Right after chapter 4, we now turn to Belshazzar. And so in between, we have a number of kings that were not talked about. So what is important for us to realize is this: the first king, Nabopolassar, the father of Nebuchadnezzar, wasn't important at all. And so his name doesn't show up in the Bible. Now, what is important for us to understand is those kings and the kingdoms that affected uh, Israel and Judah would be the ones that would be in focus. So we know of Evel Merodach or Amal Marduk, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but these were the ones that were not really focused on. Neither was the two others. These two were not important because time had come by. Daniel chapter 5 then suddenly moved from Nebuchadnezzar all the way down to Belshazzar. Belshazzar is not king as listed in the list of Babylonian kings, but we are told that he is king right here. So, what really did happen? We do find that Nabonidus or Nabonidus, we call it, Nabonidus was the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. And he grabbed the throne after Labashi Marduk. And so Nabonidus, that is how we would read his name, Nabonidus, is not mentioned in the book of Daniel. There is a reason, and so let me just talk about this reason first. As we know from the history books, Nabonidus was not interested in ruling the country. He was interested in the god of sin in Arabia. And so he spent his time in Arabia. And while he was away, two of his sons uh, became co-regent. And so he is a co-regent. What that means is very simply, oftentimes you find that when the king is indisposed, for example, Uzziah. Uzziah was king of Judah, and then he had a skin disease, a leprosy, a form of leprosy. And so while he had leprosy, the story is that he had to be placed outside the camp. And so he lived in the graveyard. So he had a house there. In his place, while he was still alive, his son Yotam was the what we call the regent. The regent means running the show in place of Uzziah. And after Uzziah died, then Yotam became king thereafter. So in the history books, when we look at all the reigns of the kings, Yotam was seen, while we call him regent today, he was seen as king over all. And hence, Belshazzar was really king because he was running the show. And so this word king is the one who rules. The father, Nabonidus, wasn't present at all on the throne. Technically, he was the king, but realistically, he wasn't interested. He was most of the time in Arabia, dealing with the practice of the religion there, the god of sin, the moon god, perhaps. It was in Daniel chapter 5, then we see this anomaly. And if we don't have this background, you find that Belshazzar seems to be a fictitious name, but he is not. He is really the king, the one who was ruling at this time. Now, why is Daniel chapter 5 important? Was because, as you can see in this chart, he was the last before the kingdom fell. And that is important. Belshazzar is the last of the kings of Babylon according to biblical history. Although technically Nabonidus was the one who was supposed to be king. And since he was not interested, Belshazzar came into the scene. And as king of Babylon, we are told that he had a great feast. And this great feast needs to be understood that there was a time when there is a what we'll call a festival, a feast that was a Babylonian festival. And so we can put here a Babylonian festival. This Babylonian festival was a major festival. And the way that this festival was celebrated was that there was a lot of eating and definitely a lot of drinking. And this idea of drinking and this wine drinking, uh, and this word here is hamar. Hamar is very similar to the Arabic word for wine. And this is alcoholic, and they get into a more drunken state. Now, this in itself is very important. And we are told, and much of the history we have today comes from um, the cylinders that we have found, the Cyrus cylinders, uh, and a number of these historical discoveries, how the Medo Persians were able to conquer Babylon, the city itself, without a fight. And this in itself is described in this chapter in part. Now, the fall of Babylon was not discussed, but we do see that Daniel chapter 5 provides us with the background towards the fall of Babylon. And we will talk about this when we get to the end of Daniel chapter 5. Now, in this Babylonian festival, they were drinking a lot of khamar, being wine. intoxicating wine, if you want to call it that way. It is very similar to the uh, Hebrew word hamer, and they are all made from grapes and usually red. And while he was tasting the wine, now, this idea of wine tasting, uh, and this word is used as wine tasting, I think we need to be aware. The idea of wine tasting, it is really about trying to judge the wine. So we call it wine tasting, but this is about judging the wine. He is trying to get advice on the wine. He is sensing the wine. And while he was trying to do that, he also did something else. Belshazzar gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar. Now remember, in the Eastern way, anyone who is above Belshazzar is a father. And so Nebuchadnezzar is a father. And in modern times, you will call him the great, 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 great grandfather or great, great grandfather. But nevertheless, it is called father, right? His father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, and this was part of the siege, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines could drink out of them. Now, this in itself is sacrilegious. We read in Daniel chapter 1 that Nebuchadnezzar had taken all these utensils and brought it to the treasury, the safe storehouse of the temple in Babylon, that they would not misuse these sacred vessels. But Belshazzar, and perhaps he had various reasons, whether he was intoxicated or he thought he could show a little bit of his powers to be, had decided that he would use all these sacred vessels from the temple of God taken out of Jerusalem. Verse 3. Verse 3 says, and then, and the word and then is written in the Aramaic. They brought these gold vessels which had been taken out of the temple. It is called the house of God, the temple of God. And here, the temple of God is the temple of Elah. This is the equivalent of the Hebrew word Eloah, and in Aramaic is Elah. And this is similar to the way that the Jews would refer to the temple, the house of Elohim. And it says, which was in Jerusalem. Now, this word Jerusalem is actually Jerusalem, and it is written as Jerusalem, even in the Aramaic. So the king and his nobles, his wives, his concubines, uh, drank out of them. Now, this this word here, uh, the concubines would be the king's consort. This would be his wives, his consorts, also the queen. All of them, right? The wives and concubines. I think we need to bear that in mind. That would be the way that it is described here in verse 3. The queen, actually, and the concubines. So, what happened now is what Belshazzar gave instruction. Everything happened in verse 3. We will take a look at verse 4. As they were drinking the wine, and then they were praising. The word praise here uh, is shavak. Now, the word shavak is to adulate, to commend. I think we can use this to commend, to adulate, to say great things, and to give glory. And it says here that they give glory to the gods of gold, silver, and this is copper, iron, wood, and stone. Now, this is a very unusual expression, I think, if you want to call it that way. The expression here literally means they were not just drinking from the vessels from the temple, but they felt that they are going to desecrate the origins of the vessels. They are thinking that the gods of the gold and silver and copper and iron and wood and stone is far better than the God of Jerusalem, the God in Jerusalem, in the house of God there. Now, what this historical narrative is trying to disclose to us is the desecration of the honor of the God of the Jews. Because now they have the Jews in exile for 70 years. It's almost there at the end of 70 years. And maybe there is a view that is being taken that uh, Belshazzar felt that 70 years has passed and nothing happened. And it's because he counted his 70 years from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. That wasn't the case. That is at least one more year thereafter, the 70 years will be up because Daniel chapter 1 tells us that. And so, in his miscalculation, he may have thought that the God of the Jews is wrong. And so, he is desecrating and praising other gods, the pagan gods. Now, what is important now is in verse 5, and we'll take a look at verse 5. Suddenly, and the word suddenly is actually at that time. At that time, where when they were thinking that the gods of the gold and silver and copper and iron and wood and stone was the one that has done better than the God of the Jews, so they are desecrating the God of the Jews. We read this: the fingers of a human hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Now, this word opposite the lampstand literally means it is a place where it is the brightest. Opposite the lampstand is where the light is shone, and this place is the brightest place. And it was written on the plaster on the wall. Now, this word plaster literally means it is made from lime, which is plaster, and it would be white. And hence, it made out to be a very good place to put some writings. Then we read this: the king, at the corner of his eye, he saw. Now, this word see means he was able to glance, he wasn't sure. Now, this word saw is a very important word. This word is about looking at a vision, seeing in a dream. So it is not clear, it is unclear. It's an unclear vision of the back of the hand that did the writing. So we should be very mindful. This word saw is not inspected, observed. It's not the regular word for seeing. So I think the word saw would be, uh, we need to treat it with a little caution. That's all I'm trying to say. It is a form of an unclear vision. It is a form of looking through uh, a looking glass where you can't really see it clearly. It is a little ambiguous. It's like a vision, a dream where you can see, but it is not absolutely clear. It's not like a modern day YouTube video. And so this would be typically describing a vision or describing a dream. And this was what the king Belshazzar actually saw the back of the hand, and it wasn't very clear to him, but he did think that it was a hand, and there was a handwriting thereafter. Now, with this, we need to take a break and we come to the end of our session today, and we will continue tomorrow.